My agent was like, no, if you write that, you'll be sued to death or worse. As soon as you get the Chinese Navy and the American Navy shooting at each other, it's likely going to escalate into nuclear war. And there are no winners in a nuclear war.
But if we realize how world history has gone, we need to adjust to what's coming and what we are almost certain is going to happen, because it's happened many, many times before in all the kingdoms and empires and Game of Thrones that have been happening before.
And he's doing things that are tempting World War III. And he's playing with nuclear dice. Why? Reckless beyond belief.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. My name is Austin Bronner. I'm here with my co-host, Cody Shirk. Cody, are you as excited as I am for this episode?
I think I'm more excited because I get to selfishly ask our guest so many questions that I have that I'm going to be basing some of my investing decisions and really, I guess, a lot of life decisions for the next several years based upon what I'm hoping we find out today.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we tried to talk about on this podcast and the topics we always dive into, investing, geopolitics, we're kind of always thinking about where the world is going. And about 2 years ago, I was recommended a book called The New Rules of War from a friend. And I picked it up and I just devoured it because I thought it was so interesting. And it was like a very different take on the state of the U.S. military and the state of the world and geopolitics. And the author is Sean Mcfate. So I've always wanted to talk to him. Sean is going to be coming on the podcast today. Like I said, he wrote the book, The New Rules of War. He's writing another book about shadow war. He is a former military officer in the 82nd Airborne. He served with Stanley McChrystal. And then he transitioned into being a private military contractor where he was sent into Africa. He dealt with African warlords. He raised armies for the U.S. interest. He conducted some strategic reconnaissance for like the oil and gas, mineral industry. He's even transacted arms deals in Eastern Europe. He's a very interesting guy. He was then a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, and is a professor of strategy at the National Defense University and Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He is a fascinating character. We're very excited to chat with him about all things war, foreign policy, and where the world is going in this interesting time of transition between administrations in the U.S. and this time of increased conflict around the globe. So, Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's always great to be here.
I'm very excited to chat with you. I'll tell you, I got your book recommended to me by a friend about 2 years ago, and I sat down, and there it is. I sat down, started reading it, and I found myself reading it for the next 4 hours in bed until it was around 11:30 at night. And one of the reasons why it was so interesting to me, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited to chat with you, is because I felt like reading your book, you said a lot of the things out loud that many people don't want to say about the U.S. military.
Yeah.
And our preparation. And I want to dive into that today, and I'm very, very interested. But before we go into that, I'm very interested in asking you a question because I did a little bit of research, and I found that you are a very big opera fan, and you talk a lot about opera and war and how are they connected. I'm interested in your take.
Well, it is true. My two passions in life are war and opera. I cannot account for that. But I think, look, I mean, both are passionate. One is, war is perhaps the worst and the greatest endeavor of the human condition. You see the worst, most vile aspects of human nature, but you also see some of the most heroic and compassionate as well. Not by warriors, but by those who try to rescue orphans and so forth. Opera is a distillation of that. Not a perfect one, but there's something for me that's very encompassing about song, voice, theater, all of those that were captured. Before there was cinema, there was opera. and I find it a very moving way in ways that that are subliminal. And I'm not an opera proselytizer, nor am I an opera snob. But for me, these opera also has, in my life, I've been in some dark places physically. And opera was a nice counterbalance to some of the horrors that I saw in Africa and so forth. It kept me sane.
Well, when I heard about it, I kind of visualized you writing this book about mercenaries and the future of war with big opera blasting in the background as you kind of typed away.
Yes, that's not fully wrong. I mean, I also write a lot of fiction. I write. I have a trilogy. A John Locke. He's like it's like a thriller. It's like a novel thriller. It's like Tom Clancy, but it's about mercenaries, and it's largely nonfiction. It started off as a memoir about something I had done in that world, and my agent was like, no, if you write that, you'll be sued to death or worse. So he's like, fictionalize it. And so I did, and it became a series, but the main character is a big music lover. And it's interesting to see how classical music, at least for me, does fuse its way into that ugly world, and how in some ways it was the Xanax for me that Xanax is for other people.
Sure. Well, I know you spent a lot of time first in the military and then as a private contractor. And as I was reading the book, I know you served under Stanley McChrystal.
Yes.
And I think he even said he wrote your recommendation to go to Harvard.
Yeah, he did.
After. I'm really interested. I'm very interested in your experience with him, because there's for the layman, the person who hasn't followed much about it, you've got, his dismissal by Obama, and there's a lot of people might just be hung up on that. What did you learn from your time serving from him, and what do you feel like is the biggest misconception about McChrystal?
Yeah, Stan McChrystal was a military mentor of mine way back, like 30 years ago. I was a very junior officer. He was a lieutenant colonel, my battalion commander in the 82nd Armored Division. He was without doubt the greatest leader I've ever served with or worked with, and he is still a model for me about how to be a leader. He's the type of man who inspire people to follow him because he was genuinely earnest, honest, compassionate, and tough. And he had that rare inspiration. He didn't yell at you. He never yelled at anybody. He had a way of making you want to be better, which is magical. I think that all people know today is what happened, how he got fired in Afghanistan. And he doesn't, his attitude about that was like he made a mistake, and he owns it. He's not trying to rationalize it. But I mean, that whole event happened. He had for some reason, they allowed like a stringer journalist working for Rolling Stone into their inner camp for like a month. And they all got marooned essentially in Iceland. This is when there was a big like volcano going off in Iceland. And he didn't say anything, but his horse handlers, his staff around him, they got tipsy. They were in a bar, and they were like complaining about the Obama administration. And this journalist just wrote it all down and published it, and cast him as this rogue general, which I don't think he was. But that's what, if people know him today, that's why. It's really a shame, because I think he's a great man. He's done great things since. I think we'll see what happens now, because I think that there's some talk in the Department of Defense that the new Trump administration is going to reactivate retired generals simply to court-martial them. If that happens, he might be on that list. I don't know. I think that would be a travesty for lots of reasons. Not that I don't agree that general officers need more accountability, but sort of, resurrecting retired ones to court-martial them, I think is kind of a little too much. But he was a great man, and I still look up to him, and he's served as a role model for me as a leader.
So I want to ask you a question real quick on the court-martialing. This will lead into everything we're talking about here. That word just kind of made me have a ping of what you've talked about previously in your book, but also in your presentations that you make. And that's specifically about Billy Mitchell, who warned about Pearl Harbor 15 years before it even happened. And the U.S. government ended up court-martialing him for basically saying, hey, you're so incredibly wrong about making this prediction that you're creating a frenzy of worry. We don't need any more of your input. So that word you just said, court-martialing, made me think about the beginning of your book and really how you start your presentations out and how the U.S. right now is approaching conflict and the global world order. And I'm curious, just bigger picture right now, today, late 2024, you're going to London to go talk to, you make a presentation. Is that still an idea that you're leading with when you tell people, hey, we need to look at what other people are saying. We need to get off this general direction that we're on right now?
Yes. I mean, absolutely. Billy Mitchell is another general officer who fell in hard times, as like McChrystal. He had Cassandra's curse. And Cassandra is this princess from the Iliad that some of your listeners, viewers might know. And she was the gods gave her the gift of prophecy, but the curse that nobody would ever believe her. So when when the Greeks showed up with this big wooden horse, she's like, don't let that wooden horse inside of Troy. It's full of Greek soldiers. Like, nah, shut up, Cassandra. And sure enough, and in some ways, that's what Billy Mitchell was. He predicted Pearl Harbor, as you said, he said it would happen on 15 years before it happened. Not only did he say it would happen, he said it would happen on a Sunday morning at 7:30 a.m. and it would draw the U.S. into a total war in the Pacific for Japan. The only thing he got wrong was that it happened at 8:30, but we can give him the credit for this. And the thing is that we were preparing for the wrong type of war. And I feel like I'm walking Billy Mitchell's footsteps because I believe that we are, there's a saying that generals always fight the last war they won. This truism happens to be true. And the last war that the U.S. won, if we're honest, is 1945. And that's what we're preparing to refight today. If you go to the Pacific, Indo-PACOM, which is our headquarters for the military in the Pacific, every day they do war games with a China-like event in the Straits of Taiwan, the South China Sea, but it looks like the Battle of Midway with better carriers and fighter jets. It's not how modern warfare works. It's an antiquated form of warfare, and we're spending almost a $1 trillion a year on our military, and it's like the Maginot Line. We're preparing for the wrong future war, and like the Maginot Line, we're going to get bested, and that's what I'm trying. It's why I wrote the New Rules of War. And I'm writing a book right now called Sneaky War, or the Dark Arts, which we can talk a little bit about. I don't know when it's going to come out, but it's about how we actually do fight and win against nuclear autocracies and avoid a nuclear war. Because right now, if you look at what the U.S. military is preparing to do in either Poland or in the Pacific, as soon as you get, the Chinese Navy and the American Navy shooting at each other, it's likely going to escalate into nuclear war. And there are no winners in a nuclear war. But that's what we're preparing to do. It's what made the Cuban Missile Crisis a crisis. But the Pentagon they forget the Cold War and they go right to 1945. And we're spending a lot of money, and it's a very dangerous approach.
I want to dive in because one of the things that you discuss in your book is the concept of durable disorder. This is 5 years ago. Right. Yeah. And 5 years, a lot has changed. A lot, right? There's a lot of different conflicts going on right now. Can you kind of elaborate on what durable disorder is?
Yeah.
And then maybe how this applies to the current global conflicts that have escalated even since you've written the book?
Okay. So in the durable disorder, if you think about the history of the world, we were taught in grade school that big states are timeless and universal. There's always been states in the world. And then when, states fail, then it's anarchy, it's Mad Max and the Thunderdome, it's all that stuff, right? It's the Dark Ages. And that's not true. What happens is that most of the world, states were not in charge of everything. I mean, today's states are the global geopolitical unit. But, if you look at the Middle Ages or antiquity, you had kingdoms, you had empires who are not states. I mean, Rome was it was a city with an empire. It wasn't a modern state with state institutions and a bureaucracy like we think of it today. You had all sorts of weird things. You had the Catholic Church and the Vatican. They were a superpower in the Middle Ages, and not just territorially, but of people's souls. And states came along sometime around the 1650s or 1700s, monopolized geopolitics, and now we are trained to think that that's all there is. In fact, and states are receding. Most states in the world are fragile, or they're just really regimes inside of a state. I mean, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, if you go to places of Latin America, you have in Latin America, you have narco states. In sub-Saharan Africa, you just warlord states, and they're not really states. Their boundaries mean very little, etc. And so durable disorder explains what a world with fewer states looks like. It's not anarchy, as people imagine it. It's disorderly, but it doesn't all collapse into some sort of dark ages and the Knights of Ni. So I'm trying to get us to think through, if you look at, again, Africa, parts of Central Latin America, parts of Afghanistan, the Middle East, it's disorderly, but it's not gonna become this anarchy that people fear. Things muddle along like they did in the Middle Ages in Europe, but it's a durable disorder. And we have to think through this, because today we have we have Fortune 500 and the Elon Musks of the world who have more power than most states, and they wield it too. And we can't think of them as they're good patriots. They're not. I mean, most Fortune 500 companies have a tax shelter in Bermuda or whatever. I mean, they're not patriots. They're global actors. And so we have to think through what a world where states are still a part of it, but they're not the exclusive part that political science thinks that they are. You have a lot of other folks out there, a lot of other actors. And to do effective statecraft, if you will, to do effective foreign policy, you need to accommodate and account for them all. So that's what durable disorder gets to.
And I think from a U.S. perspective specifically, when I say we, anybody listening from the U.S. or myself, I'm in the U.S., we are used to the U.S.-led order since World War II, really. So this assumption that we are going to have this, let's call it what you just explained, that this is actually going to unfold is uncomfortable for someone in the U.S. thinking, oh my gosh, the world's going to change. But what you're saying is really this is how the world has been for thousands of years, more or less.
That's right.
And we are shifting back towards this. The problem, though, for the U.S. is our approach is assuming it's going to be like the last 80 years since World War II. But if we realize how world history has gone, we need to adjust to what's coming and what we are almost certain is going to happen, because it's happened many, many times before in all the kingdoms and empires and Game of Thrones that have been happening before.
That's right. I mean, Game of Thrones was based on the 100 Years' War between England and France, loosely. Less dragons. But anyway, they're, at least for what we know. But it's basically, the pendulum swung hard to states rule the world for 300 years. And now the pendulum is moving back to normal, where it's a bigger mess. And that's not a bad thing. It's just messier. In some ways, it's a good thing. I mean, let's not forget that the most, the cruelest wars in human history, World War I and World War II, were prosecuted by states and the state organization and nationalism of that. Maybe the world could do with less centralized power. But the United States is having this discussion right now. You have the Democrats with their rules-based order, and what that means is that they want American rules-based order, which China and Russia and others are trying to fight. And then you have Make America Great Again, the Republicans, who want a more isolationist perspective. They don't want an American-based rules-based. They just want to be left alone. Who is correct, who's incorrect, that's a different discussion. But this is an ongoing discussion, because if you believe in a rules-based order, then you got to be prepared to go to war in Taiwan or in the Baltics against others who are trying to impose on our rules-based order. I think Americans are sick of that after Vietnam, after the Koreas, after Iraq, after Afghanistan. So I think Americans have spoken, electing the clean sweep of the Republicans. We'll see what happens, though, because, let's not forget that President, W. Bush in 2000 was a candidate who says, no more interventions in the Balkans against Kosovo, and then of course he becomes like the intervention president. So we will see. Yeah. Put on your seatbelt.
Well, it's interesting because right now it's playing out this last week, right? And we're talking about what's Ukraine and Russia. You've got the two competing worldviews, and then you've got the Biden administration authorizing the use of these long range, I think they're called ATACMS.
Yes. Right.
Missiles. Why do you think they are doing this in the last, I guess we're talking about like 2 months of his presidency? What is the thinking behind this?
That's a good question. That's the question everybody's. I think it's a strategic blunder because Biden's a super lame duck president. He's got like less than 60 days or so, and he's doing things that are tempting World War III. He's playing with nuclear dice. Why? Just let it coast. Let the new guy come in. I'm not pro or con Trump, but I just think it's I think it's reckless beyond belief. And I think what's happening, this is my guess, is that the Biden administration is trying to reach a peace deal with Russia before Trump gets in there, and is authorizing Ukraine to put some pressure on Russia to meet some terms that Biden wants. That's my guess. I don't know. But it's really bad. And what we've seen happen is that Russia just tested a new ICBM into Ukraine. And he did this as a warning to all the countries in NATO saying, look, we can reach you. And if we decide we will start attacking any country that has been supporting Ukraine, you're going to be fair game. And also, by the way, we're changing our nuclear doctrine to lower the threshold of using nukes. So I think what's happening is that the Biden administration has recklessly upped the ante in the dying minutes of the administration. And I just think it's foolish. I mean, there are no winners in a nuclear war. And and there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war, meaning like you throw a few nukes and you'll go back to normal. I don't think that's the way war works. I think people get angry and they just escalate, and then suddenly we're back in Mad Max and the Thunderdome.
I would love to dive into some of the specifics of what's happening right now, and I'll let Austin do that in a moment. But I just want to go back just a moment to give a little more perspective, not only of what you've written about, but also how many people should be viewing what's happening right now, and talking about how this is a boiling pot of water with frogs in it. And this is something you've mentioned before. And the best analogy that I have is that the U.S. runs on 4 and 8 year presidential cycles, meaning we think about what's going to happen in 4 years, and then we're not really thinking past that. Meanwhile, Russia and China are extremely patient. They're extremely tactical, and they're thinking in generations. And these two different wavelengths of thinking are banging into each other right now. And the U.S. is going to be the loser if we continue on this path of these two different strategies. And I think that's also what you're getting at with this escalation of war, which is Biden's doing this thing right now, or his cabinet, or whoever's pushing this, to prove a point, when really this is a short-term thing that's really could have bigger long-term effects, and it's not playing to that generational strategy that China and Russia have. And so obviously we've got the South China Sea conflict going on, or maybe future conflict. And just I wanted to lay that out and maybe dive in, Austin, if you can jump in here and start talking about like what's actually happening now for the next couple of years and where you see things going.
Well, you're correct. We have two different regime types, democracies and autocracies. Autocracies have they have some pros in their column. They have strategic patience because you have autocrats in there for life. They also have centralized authority that can move very quickly. They don't have this messy democracy that's open, transparent. They can move. They centralize everything at the very top. They can move very quickly. They can do it in secret. They also don't care about rule of law, international law. They don't care about, they don't have to worry about free media. They control the media. They control their industries. They control everything, really.
But that's a joke about communism, right? It's the efficiency of progress without the interruption of democussia.
That's right. Exactly.
That's basically what China's doing.
That's right. But China, though, they're not really communists, though. They're something different. Russia is a it's a Putinocracy. And meanwhile, we have the circus of democracy. Now, I'm not. Okay, let me rephrase this. I'm not anti-democracy. I would not want to live in China or Russia. I'm pro-democracy, but it's messy. And but rather than and then we have the schizoidness. Like during the Cold War, everybody felt the breath of the Soviet nuclear threat down their backs, right? Everybody, and if there's one thing that united Dems and Republicans back then, it was the Soviet threat. And also you had a World War II generation who were in politics. Nowadays, we don't have that. We don't have that historical memory of what total war feels like. We actually have think tanks who are so naive, they're actually pushing for nuclear war, like the Atlantic Council, where I used to work. They have a scholar there who suggested that if China invades Taiwan, the U.S. should do a first strike nuclear option, which is just insanity. So you have all these PhD experts who are, delusional and dangerous. You have the Republicans and Dems are completely on two different planets about foreign policy. I mean, even our allies don't even know what's going on. And even, what do I know? I don't know. I mean, again, what Trump is, I've learned, I think we've all learned, don't try to predict what Trump will do, so I don't know what's going to happen. But I will say this, is that the way we're preparing for the Pentagon calls this great power competition, U.S. versus China, U.S. versus Russia. The Dems want to accommodate, and it's just well, that's not true either. But we are all over the map, and I think the one thing that we are doing, I think, is very incorrect. Is we're putting all of our money into the military. The military is just one component. We also need good course of diplomacy. We've got to think about trade wars. We've never done a trade war because in the Cold War, you had two different economic blocks, a communist one and a free trade one. We've got to think about information warfare, cyber warfare. A lot of these things are not done out of the Pentagon. They're done elsewhere in our government. Giving all the money to F-35s and more ships doesn't do anything when every carrier in the South China Sea will be in the bottom of the South China Sea in 20 minutes if there's actually a shooting war. And sailors know that. So, I'm pushing a different idea. I think there are ways to target autocracies in sneaky ways, dark arts ways. And we need to do that. We need to create the conditions for their capitulation. We did it in the Cold War. We won. We need to do more of that again today. But, members of Congress are, they're we need more airplanes, they need, more military stuff. So I'm pushing a different approach to it. But we'll see where that lands.
I think diving in specifically to, the Ukraine conflict right now, right? Yeah. So you're talking about some of these sneaky ways and ways that the U.S. could win in a way that is not traditional. What are some of the ideas that you have, or let's just say that we put you're in charge of the next year to 2 years of strategy towards from the U.S. to Ukraine. What's the first thing you're doing? What's the first thing you're changing? Okay,
well, I wouldn't just focus on Ukraine. I would focus globally. Okay. Mm-hmm. And there's a debate, should the U.S. be involved in Ukraine or not? Let's put that to the side because it can be a distraction. Yeah. If we want to discuss it, we can. The U.S. is locked in an engagement with autocracies, nuclear autocracies in the case of Russia and China, but Iran as well to some extent. Iran can become nuclear quickly. And we've seen the rise of autocracies in the last 25 years. I mean, in 2000, over half the world was living in a democracy. Now it's less than 30%. And we're seeing autocratic creep in democratic politics in the EU, in the United States. We can debate if that's a good thing or not, but that's happening. What I would do is this. The way you win, the way you defend against an autocracy is that a good defense is actually a strong offense. If you want autocracies to stop doing disinformation and doing other things to us, you can't just ask them and then try to correct all the disinformation they put out, or TikTok or whatever. The way you do it is you have to push back at them. and then say, okay, look, if you continue to do these things, we will continue as well. So let's all knock it off. And we always bemoan how easy it is that, democracies are open societies. They can try to mess with their elections. They can do disinformation. They can do cyber, all of these things. And that's true. And if we try to engage in censorship, we will become an autocracy ourselves, which is why they continue to do this. But, but democracies are resilient. We are like tough oak trees. Meanwhile, autocracies are very strong in these sneaky ways of war, but they're also very brittle. They're like glass. And if we study their regime type like they've studied ours, they have vulnerabilities. They have squish points. And we need to do sort of ungentlemanly war to create, say, dumpster fires for them, domestically and abroad. And if there's enough dumpster fires, they will pull back their troops out of Ukraine to secure, because regime security is job number one. And these are all police states, and they require lots of boots on the ground. So if we create problems for them, like, for example, Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has the longest land border in the world. It's with Russia. It's 5,000 miles. If we give a lot of military assistance to Kazakhstan, so they start punching into Russia along this long 5,000-mile border, Russia's going to have to redeploy troops out of Ukraine to defend that long border. If we do the same in China, they're going to have to pull back troops away from the South China Sea, going to Taiwan, and deal with problems, say, in Western China with potentially a growing insurgency or something like that. So what we do is we create dumpster fires domestically and abroad. They turtle up in a defensive crouch, and we say, look, if you don't stop doing disinformation, these other things we don't like doing, we're going to keep the dumpster fires blazing. We're going to have color revolutions. We're going to do Arab Springs in your backyard, all these things. In exchange, we will put these dumpster fires out a little bit. We will help you put them out. And if you don't do what we want you to do, you'll collapse under your own weight the way the USSR did in 1989. So that's the strategy I would pursue. It's not a military. It's more of a it's a dumpster fire strategy.
Sure.
You create problems and that they have to deal with, and then you can get your way. It's not like we're going to obliterate these autocracies. We just want to push them back in their box.
I think when people think about that, right, the average American, they probably picture, okay, we provide military to Kazakhstan. What is it like? And they're thinking maybe U.S. military. They're thinking soldiers. How are you thinking about it?
We don't provide we're not going to do boots in the ground. Okay. I don't think anybody wants to do that. We're doing it. So if you look at the Green Berets, they were founded in the middle of the Cold War, not to put out insurgencies like they did in Afghanistan, counterinsurgency. They were meant to create insurgencies, to create problems. And to do security force assistance, which is what we're talking about here. Like, they arm and train and equip the Kazakh military or the Kazakh freedom fighters or whatever, secretly, covertly. And now the question is like, well, what Kazakhstan will just I don't know for a fact, but let's assume it's a pretty corrupt little republic. It's actually quite large. It's a huge place. Americans are like, what? Why are we giving money to this corrupt, non-democratic place? So it's up to political leadership to explain to them, here's why we're doing it. And here's why it benefits you. Because too often we have a failure of political leadership that we've got to go into we've got to go into Yugoslavia, we've got to go to Iraq, we've got to go, and they don't explain what we're doing and why, or Vietnam, and that's a failure of political leadership.
And I think a bigger picture too.
Go ahead, Cody.
Sorry, which bogging us down through everything you just explained is the actual economics behind it, which is the money we're spending. And you mentioned earlier the F-35, and I know that you've talked about how the F-35 program is literally more expensive. They spent more money on that than most countries' total GDP. Yeah. So the U.S. has spent more money developing a jet that is more or less, I don't want to say unuseful anymore, especially as we go into these asymmetric warfare scenarios with drones and whatnot. But we're wasting an enormous amount of economic energy into programs that are irrelevant. And so when you talk about these dumpster fire scenarios or whatever, those are not only more strategic, but they're drastically less expensive as well. And that's another area that we're completely going off the rails on.
Well, here's the deal. Like the F-35 program is going to cost taxpayers $2 trillion. That's trillion. I mean, you know, that's like 5,000 new hospitals, right? And, you know, we've been at war someplace for 20 years. These things have zero combat missions. Zero. Are they useful in a real fight? I don't think so, because if there's a shooting war between China or the US or any of these nuclear powers, it can go nuclear very quickly. And the enemy always has a vote in this, right? And that's the problem with Biden authorizing ATACMS into Mother Russia, is that we don't know what's in Putin's head. He might, you know, go nuclear by Christmas. We just don't know. And then we'll, you know, so yeah, we're spending a lot of money, a lot of opportunity cost. What are we not buying that we need to buy? Like, how do we defend against cyber? And we need a cyber army to defend against cyber. Right now, Cyber Command just defends the federal government networks, not the whole country. That's wrong. Disinformation, what do we do about that? And also other needs domestically, like healthcare and education and all these things, right? And what I'm suggesting, and also these programs don't come in line for 12, 15 years. I mean, what's the world going to look like in 2035? Yeah. It's not going to look like now. And so the things that I'm asking us to do, which is what we did in the Cold War, is we fight we fight covertly to create problems that create concessions for us. That stuff we can do today, and it costs almost nothing. You know, not even like DoD budget dust. And the reason we don't do them, we have amazing offensive cyber. We have amazing special forces. We have amazing other covert abilities that would blow people's minds. The reason we don't do them, and maybe they're good reasons, is that senior policymakers are risk averse. They'd rather, and I think Congress likes some of these big ticket items as well. I mean, aircraft carriers cost $13 billion a pop. And we're buying like 5 of them. And are they antiquated? Are they like the battleship in 1939? The battleship was obsolete in 1939, but it took the Battle of Midway before people realized it, except for Billy Mitchell. Because the Battle of Midway, the most decisive naval engagement of the 20th century, was fought entirely through naval aviation. It was won that way. Never did the two surface fleets see each other. And after World War II, people stopped buying battleships and started buying aircraft carriers. I think the aircraft carrier now has outlived its usefulness, but it's sucking all this money, and that's a huge opportunity cost for our budget.
It sounds like a lot of what you're talking about, it's creating these dumpster fires and then using them to create concessions and get back to the negotiating table, right? And end these things. What do you think is, from everything that I've read and heard, there's been really no communication between the Biden administration and the Kremlin. What is the strategy there, and why have we shut down our communication rather than ramp up the communication in pursuit of what you're talking about, concessions to end these conflicts?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I don't know what goes on, you know, Secretary of State Blinken's head. I think the strategy for Ukraine has always been not to help Ukraine win the war, but give enough arms to Ukraine so they chew through the Russian military for us and for NATO. And they've done that, but we've given them enough not to win, but to keep in the fight. And you could think of that as moral, immoral, but I think that's it. In that scenario, you don't need to communicate, I guess, to Russia. But the thing,
you're communicating with your action, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And and I think you know, and remember, you know, Biden has been very strong on reuniting NATO. I mean, I think one of the assumptions that Putin had is that NATO would collapse into a bucket of rust. And I think that's still possible, by the way. I think there's a lot of NATO fatigue around Ukraine, and they secretly would like to have President Trump come in and stop it. But, you know, as Blinken has solidified NATO, well, guess what? we've also solidified indirectly an axis of autocracies between China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. So everything has an equal and opposite reaction. So does that make the world safer or less safe? I don't think it's safer in many ways. I think it's preparing the world for maybe a grand showdown, which would be horrible. And remember, big wars are often started by miscalculation, like in World War One. All powers went into that war thinking it'll be over by Christmas 1914. And it was one of the worst wars in history. So nobody wants that, but what you want and what you get are two different things a lot.
So to execute a lot of what you're proposing, for lack of a better term, these dumpster fires, one of the big things that keeps coming up in your presentations and what you've talked about are these, I don't want to call them mercenaries, but let's say private contractors, American Foreign Legion, whatever it is. And I think most Americans, or maybe around the world, usually thinks of the Wagner Group in Russia or Blackwater, which is Eric Prince's company, which was acquired, long story. But the point is, there's kind of been this opinion that these are secretive, very maybe doing like very evil things behind the scenes. But what you're saying is there's another way to use these private contractors for, they're not only much less expensive, but much more effective. So could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, we can call them dumpster fires. We can call them strategic emergencies. We can, whatever you want to call them, but it's essentially what they are, and we should be fire starters is my point. And the book I'm writing is called Fire Starters. It's all about how to do this in real time. Mercenaries or contractors, they are like fire. They can burn down your house. They can power a steam engine. It really depends on how you use them. There are always safety and accountability problems. But the truth of the matter is that, mercenaries, it's the second oldest profession in the world, right? This idea that mercenaries are illegal and evil and outlaws is only about 200 years old. It's not It's not a historical fact. I mean, Rome used mercenaries all the time. So in the Middle Ages, the Vatican, the popes used mercenary armies a lot. I mean, it's just the way wars were fought. And we're, again, as durable disorder takes in and a lot of states, recede, or we're seeing the rise of mercenaries once again. The pendulum is swinging to normal, and that's private warfare. And that's private warfare acts in a very different way than, say, public warfare. People fight and die for different reasons. It's very transactional. There's a lot of problems. Both parties rip each other off a lot. Not just, mercenaries of their masters, but also masters of the mercenaries. When Wagner Group marched on Moscow in June 2023, it wasn't a mutiny like people think. This is how mercenaries historically renegotiate contracts, because there are no courts of law to sue in. So you have to take up arms against your master. The master hires a different mercenary group to go after you. That's what history is like. That's what Machiavelli was talking about in The Prince in 1513, that booklet. And he also got burned badly by his mercenaries, which is also one reason he's so bitter about them. But I think we're seeing the return of mercenaries. And what does that mean? It means that suddenly the rich people in the world can become armed and dangerous. You have like Jeff Bezos or, ExxonMobil. They have national interests around the world. Well, they have their own security interests around the world. And do they think of themselves as I'm American first or I'm Jeff Bezos first? So what happens when anybody with enough money can start a war for any reason they want? That's the world we're entering. And there's good and bad. I mean, you can imagine the bad, but imagine this. Just say there's an ISIS 2.0. They start capturing and crucifying Christian men in the Levant, like Syria and Iraq, and they sell girls and women off in a sex slave auction and on an app, which is what they used to do. What if a mega church, which has tens of millions of dollars, hires mercenaries to go in and do a humanitarian intervention to save Christians? Right? I mean, mercenaries are not inherently good or bad. They get treated like cheap Hollywood villains. But, a lot of mercenaries I know, and I know a few, past and present, would rather be doing the humanitarian intervention than massacring villages in North Nigeria. So some are not. Some are psychopaths. We know that. But it's a much more sophisticated world than mercenary bad, soldier good.
And there's also different end goals of these people hiring the mercenaries. I'll use Elon Musk as an example.
Yeah.
His goal, he says it out loud, is multi-planetary, expansion from Earth.
Yeah.
And if that is his best route to get there is by helping Trump get elected and hiring whoever to do or push his agenda forward, I think we're seeing these powerful people take more of that strategy, which is what you started to share at the very beginning of our conversation, which is how these empires are shifting here. So from a business perspective, we're investors. We typically travel around the world looking for different opportunities. You mentioned Exxon. We've been down in Guyana, which is where they're at. There's lots of things going on in Africa right now. Do you see more governments heading this way, or do you think that the U.S. is so far behind the 8 ball that they're not even going to consider that for a while, and we're going to let these other governments hire these mercenaries and get ahead of us?
Well, it's an interesting question because if we hire mercenaries, we're abetting mercenary proliferation. And you got to think of mercenaries like a weapon system. You're proliferating. That's good, but my point of view, that's already happening. Like the proverbial, horse is out of the barn, toothpaste is out of the tube. You can't put that back. And we had a role in that, and using some of these types of people in Iraq and Afghanistan for a long time. Also, people think of Wagner Group as some sort of secret GRU militia. The GRU is like Russia's one of their intelligence agencies. It's not. The Wagner Group that was their client. They were working for the Russian government. They're now still in Africa. Prigozhin, who owned the Wagner Group, who's allegedly dead, he always kept his best mercenaries in Africa looking after his business interests. He didn't send them to Ukraine. That's like sending them to Stalingrad in World War II. And those guys are now rebranded as Africa Corps under Moscow, but they're not loyal to Moscow. They signed some document saying we're loyal to Moscow. They just throw that away. What's going to happen is right now they're still there because they're private sector actors. The money is good enough for them, but they're going to start to peel away. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to places like Katanga province in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Because, in some ways, what oil was to the world economy in the 20th century, rare earth minerals will become, I think, in our century. And there's only so many places you can go for that. All the easy places have been mined. So only the hard places are left, like Afghanistan and Central Africa. And that's where you're going to get these mercenaries with these pirate mining groups going to go carve that out of durable disorder, and they're going to smuggle that stuff to the Emirates, to Beijing, to wherever. And we need that for electronics, for battery electric vehicles, for quantum computing. I mean, we need it. So I think that's what's going to happen, and I think the private sector is going to use these more than governments. Governments use them because they give governments good plausible deniability. If you talk about creating dumpster fires, mercenaries are a great way to do that because, look at a couple years ago, the president of Haiti was assassinated by Colombian mercenaries. We caught the mercenaries, but they don't know who hired them, right? That's the thing about mercenaries. It's the ultimate plausible deniability tool. If you catch a SEAL doing something in Russia, we know it's a SEAL or a Green Beret or whatever. But if you catch a mercenary, there's so many cutouts between the end user and the mercenary that we can only just theorize. I mean, we think we know who hired them, but we just don't know. And that's why governments use them, rich governments. But I think more and more the Elon Musks will use them. And let's also not forget that Elon Musk will have his own private mercenary space force in orbit someday.
Well, would you think there's a place for, just to set context, I know Trump has talked about loosely using some special forces in Mexico, right, to battle cartels. Do you think there's a place for mercenaries? And do you think that would be a better use of sending people down there? Or how do you think it plays out with the cartels? Is there a use for what you're talking about? Because it is a dumpster fire on our border.
Yeah, it is. So the irony is we spend more time obsessing about the Middle East than south of our own border. And Central America is a big not narco states. I think Mexico is a narco state. The problem with mercenaries is reliability. and accountability and safety. I mean, the problem with the mercenaries have always been is that they might go down there and make a deal with the cartels who pay them a lot more, and they play both sides of the aisle. I mean, that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
So there's an argument for using American forces. Of course, if you tell that to the State Department, they freak out. They're like, "Oh, you can't declare war on Mexico." But there's a lot of people also in the federal government who don't view Mexico as a they look at it as a failed state. And now with fentanyl kills more people every year than all the Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined over 20 years. So, and there's some argument that China's behind fentanyl, and that's a debate. But we do know that in terms of Americans, getting harmed and causing problems in our society, it's coming from south of our border more than it's coming from, Iraq. So maybe mercenaries would be a use here, but how do you control them? How do you keep them from going into business with the enemy? That's an old problem of private warfare.
It's very interesting. I want to shift and talk a little bit about one of the other major conflicts going on right now and get kind of your take on it. So Israel and Palestine, Israel and Iran. You've got a very interesting conflict going on there, and multi-pronged. You've got Palestine, Israel, and then you've got Iran backing and pushing these military groups. In your book, you talk about this idea that hearts and minds do not matter.
Yeah.
Right? They don't matter. It's one of your rules. And one of the sections, this section was one of my, was the most interesting to me because you talk a little bit about the history of the Romans and first century Judea. I think you described it as a pit of asps for the Romans.
Right.
And, right now we're seeing there's a lot of frustration with how Israel is dealing with Palestine. But there's also on the other side, there was a terrorist attack that wiped out a scale that was much larger than 9/11 if you put it in terms of their population. So from a counterinsurgency perspective, what do you feel like the Israelis are getting right, and what are they getting wrong about what they're doing in the Middle East?
That's a great question. So I think rule number 4, in this book, The New Rules of War, I lay out 10 rules. It's a theory of modern warfare. We can talk about the first rule for Ukraine. I say the first rule is like conventional war is dead. And people are like, Ukraine's a conventional war. And we can talk like, well, not really, but we can talk about that. So I think that hearts and minds at the strategic level matter a lot. And that's what disinformation is trying to do. Chinese, Russia, and disinformation is not trying to win our hearts and minds. It's trying to confuse our hearts and minds, which is different. But I think information matters a lot. I think what I'm critiquing is that our strategy of counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan was doomed to fail from the beginning because we had this notion that if we just give people stuff like hospitals and education and they will give us their political allegiance. And it turns out, goodness knows that populations are not bribable, right? People are bribable, but not individuals are bribable, but not populations. So that's why it failed. And if you actually want to subdue an insurgency, there's a couple things you do. You can look at examples of the Romans. You can look at, there's examples throughout history. But you've got to, some of it's genocidal. You go in there and just kill as many people as you need to. And Israelis call this mowing the lawn, by the way. I have a euphemism for this. You have to import your own people into their land so that they become a minority in their own homeland. Which is sort of like think about China and Tibet. They've done this. They went in there, they killed a lot of Tibetans. They imported every year more and more Han Chinese get there by this super high altitude train that the Tibetans are becoming a minority of their own homeland. And then you export those people to other places. So like in World War II, Chechnya rose up against Stalin, against the Soviet Union, and Stalin in the middle of World War II took all these Chechens and he spread them across the 13 time zones of the Soviet Union so that they became a minority in somebody else's homeland and neutralized them in Chechnya. And lastly is you have to re-educate the kids. And we've done this too. We've had colonialists, as we did this in the West in the 19th century, which is what we kind of did. We took Indian kids and put them in these American boarding schools where they kind of got the Indian taken out of them. Those things that's how you do it. That's what the Romans did in Judea in 60 AD and again in 132 AD. And that's when the diaspora began, and it worked. It doesn't, if you're going to do counterinsurgency, it's bloody, it's immoral, and it takes a long time. And it doesn't collapse the minute you leave, which is what happened in Iraq as soon as we left in 2011. It all collapsed. That's Petraeus' legacy. He doesn't want to talk about it, but, that's what... I think there's a lot of, ironically, and perhaps perversely, there's a lot of Israelis who are like, we need to do that in Gaza. We need to do that in, the Western Bank. We need to do that just north of our border into Hezbollah land in South Lebanon. And I think that they've got them on their knees. And I think there's some interest inside of Israel to we have to finish them off once and for all. Otherwise, they'll reconstitute and they'll be a pain in our ass again. And I think we've seen...
Do you think it's possible to do that?
Yeah.
In the age of social media and the age of everyone having a camera and being able to document, everyone's an independent journalist at this point.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they can get away with it. I'm not saying they should, but I think they've given up on the UN. They have nobody in Israel really cares about the UN, right?
Yeah.
They're used to being a pariah. They have a strategic narrative of a siege mentality that goes back to the Ben Gurion, the Jabotinsky Iron Wall essay of 1920, that it's us against the world. I think they're hardened for that if they couch it as it's our survival. Should they do that's another question, but I think they can do it. And this, remember, this is actually just one war. In rule number 9 of my book, I talk about shadow wars will be the future. And that's what Iran and Israel have been fighting. It's a shadow war. And Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah, these are just tentacles of Iran. And throughout Syria in the last 10 years. But this shadow war has now come out of the shadows. The question is, will they try to put it back into the shadows, or will it continue to escalate more and more out? That's very dangerous.
So going into that shadows idea, I want to ask, well, I can think of China, me personally, I won't put words into your mouth, but I think of TikTok, I think of fentanyl, I think of all of these kind of subliminal things that are happening that are pushed by them that doesn't really seem super aggressive, but certainly is shifting our culture. And you've mentioned how it's like a giant game of chicken. I'm curious about any things that you see coming. Again, we're in 2024 into next year from China, from Russia, from Iran, from anywhere towards the U.S. population that we should be aware of that's coming, even though when it does come, we may not be super alarmed. It's one of those like kind of subliminal things. Do you see anything on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about this. So, like, this past week, a Chinese trawler was, tearing up optic cables on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, and they did this last year too. The sea captain was dragging his anchor across, and he's like, "Oops, I didn't know," which is preposterous. And of course, again, the name of the game is plausible deniability, which is why mercenaries are coming back in vogue, and China's doing the same thing with that. We didn't know who these guys, we didn't know who that fishing trawler was or whatever, and same with the Wagner Group. Russia's like, well, we don't know who those Russian-speaking, heavily armed guys are in Syria, in Libya, and wherever. They're war tourists. And, what I say is like, well, if Russia doesn't know who they are, then who will miss them by morning, right? I mean, so I think we should, do some dark arts back, and that's my position. Now, things that we need to be aware of are things like China has a strategy for this. It's called their 3 warfares strategy. And it's a way to like create dumpster fires for the United States and for the West. And here are the 3 warfares. One is information warfare, and that's their media outlets, and it's all state stuff and all that nonsense. And also collecting. They hack into insurance companies and steal all their data. They hack into they use your iPhone as a collection device. And one of the things that was funny to me is that TikTok is a big collection device. Is that people were freaking out about that Chinese spy balloon, taking a picture of it on their iPhone or Android and uploading it to TikTok, not realizing that TikTok's a spy balloon in your phone, right? I mean, it's just nuts. And so that's one, is information warfare. The second one is psychological warfare. And this is where they try to modify the behaviors of their target, which is us, to become antisocial, criminal, and it's working, again, through TikTok. So TikTok, you probably have heard of Kia Boys, the Kia Boys challenge. And TikTok, it's a couple years ago, they had like this video instructing teens, American teens, how to like rip off and steal and hotwire a Kia in like 30 seconds with a brick and a USB cable. And it started this huge pandemic of people's Hyundais and Kias being stolen by teenagers for joyrides. It got so bad, like car insurance companies won't insure your Kia in like St. Louis or Milwaukee. And it's a huge problem. And it's creating, they also do things to make teenagers get hooked on TikTok 80 hours a day. And it's, creating teenage depression, especially amongst adolescent women, etc. And that's all deliberate. Their algorithms are trying to create poison in our culture, and they do it through TikTok. Now, ironically, China has its own version of TikTok, but it's only allowed you, if it's a teenager, you can only be on it for like 4 hours a week. And it only shows patriotic things and like science experiments you can do in your kitchen at home. It's not like their export version of TikTok, which is why countries like India have banned TikTok altogether.
So you're saying TikTok's algorithm isn't open source?
Yeah, exactly. And China was outraged. It said, we have nothing to do with TikTok, except when we wanted to ban it, the government was outraged that we would ban it. And I'm not saying that, Facebook and Twitter or whatever don't do similar things, but they're not controlled by a hostile government. And the last of the three warfares is lawfare, legal warfare, where they try to use a rule of, if we were to deploy to a war in China, God forbid, they would try to use their own, they'd hire lawyers here to put road, speed bumps in a way that you can't drive on this road because it's protected by whatever. You can't use this bridge for tanks, or they try to subvert international law in their favor. But there are three warfares: information, psychological, and legal warfare. This is what they're trying to do to create dumpster fires for us. And we should expect to see more variations of this theme next year.
All right, I want to ask you some questions, kind of a little bit more rapid fire before we wrap this thing up. I'm very interested in your opinion on the appointment of Pete Hegseth as the potential next Secretary of Defense.
I'm a lot less bombastic than most people are. I think, first of all, the Secretary of Defense, we've had too many insiders in that job. Retired four-star generals. That's not, we want civilian control of the military. It doesn't mean taking a retired four-star and putting a suit on him and say you're now a civilian. We also had like insiders from Boeing, Raytheon, and stuff like that. That's like the fox guarding the hen house. I think an outsider is good. Should it be this guy? I don't know. I think we, and remember, if you look at Donald Rumsfeld was the ultimate insider of defense. He was a former SecDef himself, and he was like the worst SecDef in history. So I think it's okay. Also, SecDefs really don't have as much power as you might imagine. And I know that Trump wants to, kill the deep state, the administrative state, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to get into does that exist or not. But I will say this, is that the Department of Defense is this gigantic bureaucracy. And the Secretary of Defense might be the most powerful individual in this very large bureaucracy, but he doesn't rule it like God. There's only maybe a few things that he can really do. And so in that case, I don't think whether it's him or somebody else. Well, he can, if he is what we call, he can do a couple of legacy projects, right? If he wants to kill the F-35, he could try to find a way to do it. If he wants to promote something, he could. But there's only a few things he can really lean into. Most of the day-to-day is done by a bureaucracy, because it's impossible for everybody to do everything. He has to meet with other secretaries of defense around the world. He's probably good at that as a TV guy. But some of these things are more he's more of in some ways a hood ornament than he is of he's the guy who's behind this gigantic bureaucracy. Secretaries of defense, even insiders, have a really hard time wrangling the Pentagon's bureaucracy. And that could be a good or it can be a bad thing.
How much control would he have over the VA and reforming the VA? Could that be a legacy project? And that's something he's talked about substantially.
Well, I think no, because there's a different cabinet member who does that. I mean, he would work with them, and he probably was talking about that because that's probably the job he was actually seeking. But he got the prize. I mean, Secretary of Defense is the prize. And I don't know what went into, future President Trump's decision. We'll see what the Senate does with him. I think he might be more like a Matt Gaetz who suddenly pulls his application because he's gotten, vibes from the Senate that the Republicans won't vote for him. I don't know. So that's a space to watch.
Yeah.
I have one last question for you from my side. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to know what you think about China and Taiwan within the next I won't even put a date on it, within the next decade. Do you think they make a move on it?
No.
No, okay. Right there, you answered it.
They will not. They can't. I mean, even if they wanted to, they can't. They don't have enough amphibious warfare ships to do it, right? They could try to build a bridge. Good luck. They can't. I think the earliest they can do it is 2027. And some people read that, well, that's the year they're going to invade. I don't think so. To them, they want to avoid the bloodshed. They're looking at what's going on in Ukraine, and they don't want that. And they look at this as their long-lost brothers who need to be brought into the fold, whether they want to be brought into the fold or not. And I think we talked earlier about how autocracies have strategic patience. I think they said by 1 October 2049, Taiwan will be absorbed. And I think that's what's going to that's a better chance of what's going to happen. They'll be economically, culturally absorbed. It won't be as a massacre. It won't be any of these things. And remember, they're still ingesting Hong Kong, right? And that's nothing.
Yeah.
The Taiwanese people, if they want to launch an insurgency, they've been preparing for this for 50 plus years. So it could be a pretty brutal fight. Now, the bigger question is Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway is, I think, fairly delusional about Taiwan. And they're like, we have to defend it. And I don't think Americans want to go and fight and die for Taiwan. I just don't think that's and I think that politicians, I think part of the MAGA movement is just this. Americans are tired of dying for other people's lost causes as they see them. And that's fair. But I do think that there's a bigger issue about microchips, right? That people don't quite understand. Again, because we didn't have trade wars in the Cold War because of two economic blocks, we're all in one big economic block, and supply chains in a globalized economy are suddenly very tricky. How do you secure that? And that is what we need to be thinking about. Not how many F-35s we need, but how do we secure supply chains? How do we fight disinformation? How do we push back autocracies and avoid nuclear wars? These are the questions our national security establishment should be asking. But
what do you mean by trade wars? When you say trade wars, because Trump talks about tariffs, they talk about, we're going to tax them. Is that what you're talking about? Is it something different? How do you, for the average person, how do they understand what do you mean by a trade war?
Well, I think everything you're discussing is not a trade war. It's hard trade policy. And economic warfare is also one of the oldest forms of warfare, right? Siege warfare is economic warfare. All of these things. Our generals don't have any clue about this. I teach at a war college. We don't teach this. Our Treasury Department, beyond sanctions, cannot conceive of this. Nobody is thinking about this. And in some ways, it's a public-private partnership thing. And we don't control our companies in the U.S. We have actually free companies. And this is, we have to consider how to do this. And our companies are very powerful, as we know. And that's, good or bad. But a trade war is like a tit for tat. Imagine what Israel and what Iran are doing with their volley of missiles that go across Iraq and Jordan every other month, That's what it is. We do something, they respond by upping it up, and then we respond by upping, And it can get to a point where we're all starving our own people. And that is, the truth is, and this is true with sanctions, is that you can sanction a country, but you just make the poor people starve and the rich. Look at Kim Jong-un, the fat meatball in North Korea. I mean, he's not, he's going to be just fine. Yeah, exactly. So that's the problem with trade wars, is that like other wars, it's the average guy and gal who suffer. They're the bill payers for it, literally in this case.
Sure.
So I think that's on the table. And whether that happens, how it happens, it's like any warfare. It's a law of unintended consequences we have to watch out for.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for coming on here and chatting with us. It's been fascinating. One, I'll recommend for listeners, go buy the new Rules of War. Listen to it.
Thanks.
Read it.
It's a fast
Listen to
read.
it, audiobook, wherever. You said you're writing a new book, and you've got a fiction book. Can you talk a little bit about the two? The two that you are working on right now.
So
one that's out and one that you're working on.
Yeah, the one that's out is, I also write novels based on my own experience, and this one's called High Treason. It's like a thriller set in Washington D.C. It has like the Wagner Group. It has other but it's based on reality. I mean, I wrote this before the Wagner Group became a household name, but it's a fast-paced, fun novel around the guy called John Locke. It's a trilogy. I will brag that James Patterson, who's like one of the biggest #1 bestsellers ever. Yeah, a legend. Said that unsolicited that I'm better than Clancy. So I'm gonna take that. I'm better than Tom Clancy. You can read it and judge for yourself. And the other book I'm writing is a nonfiction book right now. It's called Fire Starters. I don't know when it's going to be out, but it's basically how do we do our own dark arts to put autocracies back in their box. We did it in the Cold War and we won. Let's do it again. People assume that we're doing this. We do not. Not enough to make a difference. I'm saying, and we could do it tomorrow. We have people, we have amazing capabilities in our country to wage some hurt on adversaries. Why don't we do more of it? Meanwhile, we're preparing for World War III, which is a loser strategy. So it'll be like the new rules of war. It's written to be read in an airport on a beach. It's not a dry academic-y tome. It's fun. It'll have a lot of anecdotes. It'll have a lot of I'm interviewing cyber warriors. You name it. It's really very cool.
Awesome. We look forward to it. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. So great to meet you, and appreciate all of your insights, and good luck in London.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Cody. It's always fun to be on your show.
Thank you.